One aspect of studying language is studying language as it gets used in a variety of non-standard ways. The understanding of this usage falls under the discipline of sociolinguistics, and what we find when we look at language in its social context is that speakers use the way they talk, their language, to convey information about their regional, their socioeconomic, their ethnic background. Groups of people have similar language patterns as a way of demonstrating that they are a group of people, much like styles of clothing or cultural habits of types of food you eat and the way you cook kind of mark you as who you are culturally. Language is very similar to that. Children learn language from their parents and their peers, so their social identity is usually some combination of those things. The idea of language, dialect, and idiolect were briefly covered earlier in Chapter 2. The different dialects of English, the primary thing that we're studying, vary from one another in a variety of ways. So we can have grammatical differences in syntax, for example, so using an expression like might, could, or being able to say the car needs washed, whereas in my dialect, for example, I would have to say the car needs to be washed with more words in there. Another thing you can often see, especially in media, or if you find like a dialect test online, it'll ask you about your words for certain things. So like putting your groceries in a bag versus putting your groceries in a sack. There are also pronunciation differences, which is what we're going to focus on in phonetics. So for example, in Chicago, in some neighborhoods, the professional football team, the Bears, gets referred to as "duh" rather than "the," and "Bears" rather than "Bears," where the S is devoiced. So those are some of the dialect patterns that we're going to talk about, because they're certainly relevant if you're going to do speech therapy. Review from talking about dialects before. Everyone speaks a dialect. Everyone has an accent, so to speak. There might be some that are more similar to what's considered the mainstream, standard American English for us, for example. But even people that have a relatively mainstream dialect do still have a dialect. As I mentioned, dialects get used for the same purpose, to use language as a marker of our identity, of our cultural belonging within some group. And the linguistic study of dialects has shown that they are just a different way of speaking. There's no scientific sense in which a dialect is an inferior way of speaking. It doesn't reflect lazy articulation. It doesn't reflect a lack of intelligence. If somebody doesn't have access to the mainstream, the standard dialect, that may reflect a lack of education, but that can be more about opportunity than about any sort of desire by the person, for example, to be uneducated. When we look at dialects linguistically, anything that somebody might point out in an essay about a dialect as some sort of thing that's lazy about the speech, or some sort of thing that's wrong, like using a double negative, you can find as a pattern in the mainstream or in the more prestigious dialects of other languages around the world. So again, there's no scientific sense in which there's an issue with how people speak when they speak a dialect. We do have this idea of a prestige dialect or a standard dialect, a socially perhaps desirable dialect. When you look at things from kind of a socio-political angle, use in the media, ability to climb the corporate ladder and have executive positions, things like that. There is still some dialect-based discrimination out there that makes it harder for people that can't use the mainstream dialect, aren't as familiar with it, to advance in those ways. Can also be the case that the use of a dialect could be considered socially inappropriate in a more formal situation. For example, at a university in a class presentation, there's kind of a default assumption that people will be speaking in the mainstream dialect rather than in their own local, regional, social dialect. Because the standard dialect is what's typically used in school, which is generally considered a formal situation. People might claim it's kind of closest to the written version of the language, but as we've seen in a lot of places in this class, there's a lot of things about, say, how words are spelled that don't really reflect how they're produced, even in a clear pronunciation, even in a pronunciation that's used with a standard dialect or with a mainstream dialect. We do run into cases with dialects that are very different from one another, where speakers of different dialects might have understanding issues with one another. We did define the difference between a dialect versus languages in terms of mutual intelligibility, in terms of an ability to understand each other. Some of these cases might relate to speech-language pathology, in that there are some speech-language pathologists that do what's called accent reduction therapy with speakers of non-standard dialects to help them speak more like the standard, more like the mainstream. For example, if people would like to be on the radio or on TV, if people would like to advance as business executives in our current social culture, which a lot of folks would argue is not a very just social culture, but in the current social culture, your dialect can be a barrier to professional advancement. And so that's one area where some speech-language pathologists work. And other folks in the field of speech-language pathology work to try to educate the public, work to try to advance causes of social justice, which includes linguistic justice, being accepting of all dialects. When we look at speech in clinical cases, so for example with children or adults that have neurological issues, it's important to be aware of dialect differences. One strategy you can take as a speech pathologist is to speak with the client's family and get some idea of what their dialect is and what kind of dialect features they have. Since people use their speech to communicate with one another, the purpose of what we would be doing as speech-language pathologists would be to help people be understood in their community. If their community is not speaking the mainstream dialect, is not speaking standard American English, trying to quote-unquote fix them to speak the standard when they have a speech issue isn't the best thing you want to do. Want to help people be able to produce their dialect in the appropriate situations where they would use their dialect, and so that requires a little bit of education on the part of the clinician to know what the target for what they're producing should be. Dialects come from the fact that languages do change over time. I say on the slide somewhat randomly, basically because we don't have a great understanding of exactly what causes languages to change, or in any particular situation why a language would change in a particular way. It's certainly the case that when speakers of different languages or of different dialects interact with one another, we can have new dialect features emerge by the contact between those different languages or those different dialects as people sort of negotiate a mutual communication system. They may settle, for example, on some pronunciations of words that are different from what they used to be. As we try to study dialects in an organized way, one of the main differences we commonly see between dialects, at least dialects of English for sure, is variation in the pronunciation of vowels. So one attempt to give us a kind of way to talk about the differences different dialects might have between one another in their vowels was on the basis of words that commonly use those vowels. So Wells created a kind of a list of 24 different groups of words that were called lexical sets that can be used as a reference point for the pronunciation of a vowel in different dialects. So, for example, we have the set of fleece words produced with an E vowel in mainstream American English, kit words produced with an I vowel, face words produced with an A vowel, dress words produced with an E vowel, and trap words produced with an A vowel, again in the mainstream or in standard American English. And as we go to other dialects of English in the US, or especially as we go to English spoken in other countries like British English or Australian English or New Zealand English, we would find differences in the vowels that are used in those words, but we can still refer to the fleece words, the kit words, the face words, the dress words, the trap words as a way to talk about that regardless of what the vowel is that's used in those words. And I've provided here a Wikipedia link to the different lexical sets, where again each one is sort of represented by an example word, and if you go look at that list, you will find some of those 24 different lexical sets have the same vowel in your dialect. They have the same vowel in standard American English and mainstream American English, but those have potentially different vowels in different dialects of English.